Have you ever wondered what the breaking point of 1,000 tons of steel looks like when it is consumed by a 1,000-degree fire? Most stories of the sea end when the ship disappears beneath the waves, but the legend of the USS Franklin begins at the very moment she was supposed to die. She was Big Ben, an Essex-class giant that carried the fire of American vengeance to the very doorstep of the Japanese home islands in 1945. To the enemy, she was a priority target. To her crew, she was an unsinkable fortress of liberty that felt like the safest place on Earth. The fascination with the Franklin lies in the secret of the unbreakable hull, a story of resilience that defies every rule of naval architecture and human logic. My name is a shadow of the smoke now, but I remember the morning of March 19th, when the sky was clear and the sun was a cold eye watching our doom. We were a crew of heroes, but on that day we became a crew of ghosts fighting to keep our home from becoming a tomb. The fascination with the morning of the disaster was the deceptive peace of the dawn as we prepared to launch our own planes to strike the Japanese mainland. The psychological weight of our proximity to the enemy coast was a silent pressure, a realization that we were deep inside the hornet's nest of the Imperial Air Force. The secret flaw of our position was the absolute focus on the offensive, leaving our hangar decks packed with fueled and armed and ready aircraft. We saw the radar blips, but the chaos of the morning flight operations created a screen of confusion that allowed a single intruder to slip through. The fascination of the hunter was his patience, a lone Judy bomber diving from the clouds with a precision that was as cold as the sea below. We didn't see him until it was too late. A dark shadow appearing above the flight deck like a bird of prey descending on its final and fatal and helpless target. The air was filled with the sound of our own engines, a roar that drowned out the scream of the falling bombs until the first impact shattered our world. The psychological weight of the first impact was a physical jolt that felt like the planet itself had been cracked open beneath our very tired feet. The fascination of the destruction was the location of the hit, as the first 500-pound bomb pierced the flight deck and detonated in the crowded and explosive hangar. The secret flaw of the Essex-class design was the concentration of fuel and ordnance in the belly of the ship, turning our strengths into a lethal and terrifying weakness. We saw the flash of the explosion, a blinding white light that was instantly followed by a wall of heat that melted the paint off the bulkheads. The fascination of the initial seconds was the total loss of control, as the secondary explosions of our own rockets and fuel tanks began to rip through the iron. We were a ship filled with its own ammunition, a giant that was being eaten from the inside out by a fire that was as hungry as the dark abyss. The air was gone, replaced by a thick and oily black smoke that made every breath a battle against the searing and toxic and heavy heat. I remember the secret flaw of the hangar deck's ventilation, which acted like a massive chimney, drawing the fire deeper into the ship and feeding it with fresh and lethal oxygen. The fascination of the inferno was the sound, a continuous rhythmic series of explosions as the tiny TIM rockets cooked off and streaked across the deck like angry and blinding suns. The psychological weight of the noise was a mental assault, a thunderous symphony of destruction that made any attempt at communication or command an impossible and desperate struggle. We saw men vaporized in the flash of the fuel lines, their final moments lost in a landscape of fire that looked like the surface of a dying and violent star. The fascination of the chaos was the way the ship began to list, her balance being stolen by the thousands of tons of water we were pumping into the flames. We were fighting a war on two fronts, the fire that wanted to burn us, and the sea that wanted to swallow our heavy and broken and tilted and burning hull. Every second was a choice between the fire and the water, a gamble with death that we were playing with the lives of nearly 1,000 souls. The fascination with the bravery of Father O'Callaghan was a light in the middle of the darkest and most terrifying hour of the ship's long and bloody and proud life. The psychological weight of the chaplain's presence was a shield for the men as he walked through the fire and the explosions to minister to the dying and the scared. The secret flaw of the fear was its infectious nature, but his calm voice was the antidote that kept the crew from descending into a total and absolute and final panic. We saw him blessing the wounded, even as the rockets whistled overhead, a figure of peace in a world that was being torn apart by the violence of the war. The fascination of the human spirit was revealed in his movements, a refusal to abandon the flock even when the shepherd's own life was hanging by a single and frayed and smoking thread. He was the soul of the Franklin, a man who believed that no soul should be lost in the dark without a hand to hold or a prayer to hear. The air was thick with the scent of death, but his presence brought the smell of hope back to the men who were trapped in the iron and the fire. I often think about the secret flaw of the ship's firefighting systems, which were shredded by the initial blasts, leaving us to fight a 1,000-degree inferno with handheld hoses and buckets. The fascination of the struggle was the sight of sailors standing on the edge of the abyss, spraying water into a fire that seemed to grow stronger with every gallon we poured. The psychological weight of the failure was a realization that we were losing the battle. The heat so intense that the very steel of the flight deck began to sag and buckle like molten wax. We saw the guns of the escorting ships closing in, not to fire on the enemy, but to help us fight the fire that was consuming our very and heavy and beautiful home. The fascination of the Brotherhood was the way the Santa Fe drew alongside, her rails almost touching ours even as our ammunition exploded in a rain of jagged and lethal and hot and sharp steel. We were being saved by our brothers, a lifeline thrown across a gap of fire and smoke that was as wide as the ocean itself and as deep as the grave. The psychological weight of the abandoned ship rumors was a pressure that built in the lower decks as the list reached 13 degrees and the power failed throughout the entire and dark giant. The fascination of the resilience was the command of Captain Garris, who refused to give the final order to leave the ship, believing the Big Ben could still be saved from the dark. The secret flaw of the despair was the silence of the engines, a stillness that made the ship feel like a dead thing, floating in a world of fire and salt and oil. We saw the wounded being transferred to the cruisers, a line of broken bodies that stretched across the water like a bridge of pain and sacrifice and raw and bloody and silent and heavy human cost. The fascination of the choice was the skeleton crew that remained, 700 men who volunteered to stay with the burning wreck and fight for her life until the end of time. We were the ghosts of the Franklin, the ones who chose the fire over the safety of the escorting ships, bound to the iron by a loyalty that defied every instinct of the living. I remember the secret flaw of the thick black bunker oil that slicked the decks, making every step a gamble and every movement a struggle against a lubricant of death and fire. The fascination of the labor was the sight of men sliding across the tilted flight deck, pushing unexploded bombs into the sea with their bare and burned and bleeding and shaking and desperate and determined hands. The psychological weight of the danger was a constant hum in the back of our minds, a realization that any one of those objects could end our existence in a single and blinding and final flash of light. We saw the horizon through the smoke, a distant promise of a home that felt like it belonged to another life or another version of our own and broken and tired and heavy and dark selves. The fascination of the grit was the way we kept moving, a mechanical devotion to the ship that had protected us for so long before she was struck by the lone and silent and lethal hunter. We were the guardians of her ruins, a crew that was trying to rebuild a fortress while it was still being consumed by the flames of the Japanese sun. The psychological weight of the first time the engines flickered back to life was a jolt of electricity that traveled through the hearts of the 700 men who remained on the dark and silent deck. The fascination of the engineering was the miracle in the engine room, where men worked in gas masks and waist-deep water to restore the breath to the giant's massive and cold and iron and heavy lungs. The secret flaw of the enemy's victory was their assumption that the Franklin was already dead, a ghost ship that would eventually sink into the mud of the Pacific without any further and violent and lethal and precise effort. We felt the vibration of the screws, a rhythmic thumping that sounded like the heartbeat of a god returning from the underworld to reclaim his throne in the light. The fascination of the movement was the sight of the wake, a white line on the dark sea that proved we were no longer a drifting target, but a living and moving and defiant and powerful and glorious and scarred warship. We were moving away from the Japanese coast, a burning mountain of steel that was retreating into the safety of the wide and blue and free and open and welcoming and distant and homebound ocean. As the first part of our story reaches its end, the fascination with the USS Franklin remains a study in the absolute limits of human endurance and the resilience of a ship that refused to die. The psychological weight of her scars is the beauty of her legend, A story of how 700 men saved a city of iron from the very gates of the fiery and dark and violent and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy hell. The secret flaw of the disaster was the fire, but the secret of the survival was the heart of the crew that stayed with the ship when the world told them to let her go. We are the witnesses to a miracle of salt and steel, the ones who remember the smell of the smoke and the sound of the rockets in the middle of the long and silent and cold and dark and oily and bloody night. The fascination of the ghost ship is her return, a journey of 12,000 miles that began with a single breath of life in the middle of a dying and burning and broken and heavy and beautiful and proud and glorious and absolute giant. We are ready for the next chapters, for the long road home and the legacy of the ship that fought the fire and won the right to live. The fascination with the hours following the initial explosions was the sight of the heavy cruiser Pittsburgh moving in to perform the impossible tow. The psychological weight of seeing our sister ship tethered to our mangled bow was a mixture of deep shame and a desperate rising hope for our collective survival. The secret flaw of the towing operation was the Franklin's lack of a functioning rudder, which caused the massive burning carrier to yaw wildly like a wounded beast in a violent and unpredictable storm. We saw the tow cables tighten until they hummed with a terrifying tension, a sound that felt like the ship's own vocal cords screaming under the strain of the thousands of tons of dead and heavy iron. The fascination of the movement was the slow, agonizing pace, as we crawled away from the Japanese coast at a speed that made us an easy target for any submarine or aircraft in the dark. We felt every jolt of the sea against our tilted hull, a constant reminder that the Franklin was only a single wave away from rolling over and surrendering her secrets to the deep. The psychological weight of the slow escape was a torture of the nerves, a feeling that the enemy's final blow was always just a single minute, or a single mile, or a single horizon away. I remember the secret flaw of the 13-degree list, which made the flight deck a treacherous slope of slick oil, jagged metal, and the debris of our shattered and charred and broken and twisted air group. The fascination of the labor was the way the skeleton crew had to walk sideways, their bodies constantly fighting the pull of gravity toward the port side where the ocean was waiting. The psychological weight of the tilt was a mental poison, a constant visual cue that the ship was no longer stable, and that the balance between life and death was as thin as a single plate of steel. We saw the water lapping at the edges of the hangar deck, a dark and hungry tongue that wanted to taste the fire that was still smoldering in the guts of the iron. The fascination of the counterflooding was a desperate game of mathematics, as we intentionally let the ocean into other compartments to try and pull the Big Ben back to an even and safe and stable and upright keel. Every gallon of water we added was a gamble with our buoyancy, a choice to become heavier in the hopes of becoming more balanced in the middle of the rising and cold salt. The psychological weight of the lower deck ghosts was a haunting reality for the men who had to descend into the lightless, flooded compartments to search for survivors and plug the leaks. The fascination of the darkness was absolute, a world where the only light came from flickering battle lanterns that reflected off the oily water and the pale faces of our fallen and silent brothers. The secret flaw of the rescue was the lack of breathable air, as the smoke from the hangar deck had settled into the lower levels, turning every corridor into a toxic and lethal and suffocating and dark and narrow and heavy trap. We heard the sound of our own breathing in the masks, a rhythmic reminder that we were the only living things in a tomb of steel that was still vibrating with the echoes of the morning's explosions. The fascination of the search was the silence, a quiet that was so deep it felt like it had a weight of its own, a pressure that squeezed the heart and the mind in equal and terrible measure. We were looking for life in a place that had become the kingdom of death, a crew of shadows moving through a labyrinth of iron and oil and the smell of the end. I often think about the secret flaw of the ship's list when it combined with the heavy swells of the Pacific, creating a rhythmic groan that sounded like the Franklin was pleading for a final and merciful rest. The fascination of the sound was its persistence, a grinding of metal against metal that told us the internal structure of the ship was being tested beyond the limits of its original and proud and heavy and American design. The psychological weight of the structural fatigue was a fear that the ship would simply break in half, unable to support the weight of the water and the debris, and the hundreds of tons of unexploded and hot and dangerous and sharp and lethal and heavy and dark and terrifying ammunition. We saw the cracks appearing in the flight deck, jagged lines that opened up like wounds in the skin of a giant that had been beaten but refused to fall to the ground. The fascination of the engineering was our only hope, the way the bulkheads held against the pressure of the sea, a testament to the quality of the steel and the hands that had riveted it together in the shipyards of the home shore. We were a ruin that was still floating, a miracle of physics that was being held together by the sheer will of 700 men and the memory of the light. The fascination with the first Japanese aircraft to find us during the tow was the realization that our ordeal was far from over and that the enemy was determined to finish what the lone bomber had started in the mist. The psychological weight of the second attack was a jolt of adrenaline that cut through the exhaustion of the crew, as we realized we had to fight for our lives while our primary weapons were nothing but charred and twisted scrap. The secret flaw of our defense was our lack of power for the main anti-aircraft batteries, forcing us to rely on the smaller guns that could be operated by hand and the sheer grit of the men who manned them. We saw the Japanese planes diving toward our smoke-filled deck, their pilots seeing a target that looked like it was already dead and waiting for the final and fatal and absolute and dark and cold and silent and heavy and watery plunge. The fascination of the Defiance was the sound of the machine guns, a stuttering response from a ship that was supposed to be a ghost, but was still biting back with the ferocity of a cornered and wounded and angry and powerful and beautiful and defiant and proud and glorious and absolute giant. I remember the secret flaw of the Santa Fe's proximity, as the cruiser stayed so close to our burning side that the heat scorched the paint off her own hull and threatened to ignite her own, and dangerous and heavy and explosive and vital and powerful and dark and lethal and sharp and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy ammunition. The fascination of the Courage was the sight of her sailors leaning across the gap to catch the lines of the wounded. A human bridge that defied the fire and the smoke and the chaos of the shifting and tilting and burning and broken and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy sea. The psychological weight of the brotherhood was a physical force, a feeling that we were not alone in the dark, that the entire fleet was standing with us in the shadow of the Japanese coast. The fascination of the rescue was its frantic intensity, a race against the clock and the fire and the enemy and the water and the dark and the cold and the silent and the heavy and the deep and the oily and the bloody and the terrifying and the absolute and the final and the heavy end of the world. The psychological weight of the empty hangar was a hollow feeling for the pilots who had survived the blast, seeing their planes, the very reason for their existence, reduced to a pile of ash and molten aluminum in the middle of the dark and burning and broken and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy iron. The fascination of the loss was the realization that the Franklin was no longer an aircraft carrier, but a massive and defenseless and drifting and burning and broken and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy target of opportunity for the enemy's final and violent and lethal and precise and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy strike. The secret flaw of our status was our invisibility to the home public, as the High Command was already preparing to report us as a loss to avoid the blow to the national morale and the pride of the Navy and the memory of the light and the spirit of the ship. We were the ghost of CV-13, a secret that was being kept from the world even as we fought to stay alive in the middle of the fire, and the salt, and the oil, and the blood, and the dark, and the cold, and the silent, and the heavy, and the deep, and the oily, and the bloody, and the terrifying, and the absolute, and the final, and the heavy sea. I often think about the secret flaw of the ship's communication, which was reduced to hand signals and runners, as the internal phone systems were melted by the fire, and the heat and the smoke and the chaos of the initial and violent and sudden and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy explosions. The fascination of the leadership was the way Captain Garris managed to maintain order through a chain of human voices, a living network of command that bypassed the broken and twisted and melted and silent and cold and dark and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy technology of the ship. The psychological weight of the silence was broken by the sound of the whistles and the shouts of the officers. A primitive and effective way to lead 700 men through the middle of a burning and broken and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy hell. We were a crew of the old school, relying on the strength of our lungs and the clarity of our purpose to keep the giant from falling into the abyss and the dark and the cold and the silent and the heavy and the deep and the oily and the bloody and the terrifying and the absolute and the final and the heavy sea. The fascination with the first time we managed to steer the ship under her own power was a moment of pure, unadulterated joy that cut through the soot and the blood and the exhaustion of the crew and the spirit of the ship and the memory of the light. The psychological weight of the self-propulsion was a sign that the Franklin was not a corpse being dragged, but a living creature that was fighting to walk back to the home shore and the safety of the wide and blue and free and open and welcoming and distant and homebound ocean. The secret flaw of the enemy's plan was the resilience of the American sailor, who refused to accept the death of his ship even when she was engulfed in 1,000-degree fire and 1,000 tons of water and 1,000 shadows of the dark and the cold and the silent and the heavy and the deep and the oily and the bloody and the terrifying and the absolute and the final and the heavy sea. We felt the vibration of the screws, a rhythmic thumping that sounded like the heartbeat of a god returning from the underworld to reclaim his throne in the light and the air and the world of the living and the free and the proud and the glorious and the absolute and the final and the heavy giant. As the second part of our story reaches its end, the fascination with the Franklin remains a study in the absolute limits of human endurance and the resilience of a ship that refused to die in the middle of the fire and the salt and the oil and the blood. The psychological weight of her scars is the beauty of her legend, a story of how 700 men saved a city of iron from the very gates of the fiery and dark and violent and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy hell. The secret flaw of the disaster was the fire, but the secret of the survival was the heart of the crew that stayed with the ship when the world told them to let her go and to seek the safety of the escorting ships and the memory of the light and the spirit of the ship. We are ready for the final chapters, for the long road home and the legacy of the ship that fought the fire and won the right to live and to sail and to be remembered as the ghost ship that refused to die. The fascination with the third day was the realization that we were being shadowed by the remnants of the Japanese air fleet, looking for one final chance to send the Franklin to the bottom. The psychological weight of the kamikaze watch was a mental erosion, as men with blackened eyes and burned hands stood by the few remaining machine guns, scanning a sky that felt like a ceiling of glass ready to shatter. The secret flaw of our visibility was the massive, lingering plume of smoke that still trailed behind us, a black finger pointing directly to our position for any enemy pilot within 100 miles. We saw the silhouettes of the escorting destroyers zigzagging around us, their crews watching the horizon with attention that mirrored our own, and desperate and weary and heavy and dark spirits. The fascination of the hunt was the silence between the alarms, a quiet that was more terrifying than the roar of the guns because it allowed the mind to imagine the invisible and silent and lethal and cold and dark shadows beneath the waves. We were a wounded giant limping through a graveyard, a ship of ghosts that was still breathing just enough to keep the predators at bay in the middle of the wide and blue and indifferent and powerful and cold Pacific Sea. I remember the secret flaw of the hangar deck recovery, where the skeleton crew had to begin the grim and soul-crushing task of identifying the brothers who had been claimed by the initial and violent and sudden and terrifying and absolute and final fire. The fascination of the horror was the way the heat had transformed the steel and the men into a single fused landscape of ash and bone, and the smell of scorched and bitter and oily and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy remains. The psychological weight of the silent roll call was a burden that broke the spirits of men who had survived the explosions but could not survive the sight of the charred remains of the boys they had shared coffee with just a few mornings before. We moved through the wreckage with shovels and canvas bags, our movements mechanical and our hearts numb to the reality of the scale of the loss and the price of the war and the memory of the light. The fascination of the duty was the respect we showed to the fallen, a quiet and dignified process that transformed a scene of carnage into a sacred and tragic and monumental and naval and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy graveyard. The psychological weight of the unexploded ordnance was a ticking clock in the back of our minds as we realized that dozens of our own 500-pound bombs were still trapped under the debris of the collapsed flight deck. The fascination of the danger was the stability of the explosives, which had been baked by the 1,000-degree heat and were now in a volatile and unpredictable and lethal and sharp and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy state. The secret flaw of our survival was that any single spark from a cutting torch or an accidental jolt from the sea could trigger a secondary explosion that would finally and fully and utterly and absolutely and finally and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy destroy the ship. We saw the bomb disposal officers working with the steady hands of surgeons, diffusing the sleeping monsters with tools that felt too small for the magnitude of the risk and the scale of the potential, and final and absolute and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy disaster. The fascination of the tension was the way we held our breath every time the ship rolled, waiting for the sound of a detonation that would never come if the gods of the sea were still watching our tired and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy souls. I often think about the secret flaw of the ship's freshwater supply, which was contaminated by the salt and the foam used to fight the fire, leaving the 700 survivors with nothing but a few bottles of juice and a thirst that felt like a physical fire in our throats. The fascination of the thirst was its ability to eclipse even the fear of the enemy, as men traded their most prized possessions for a single, warm and oily and metallic and bitter and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy swallow of liquid. The psychological weight of the dry giant was a reminder of our vulnerability, a realization that even a fortress of iron can be defeated by the simple and relentless and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy lack of water. We saw the sailors of the Santa Fe tossing crates of oranges across the gap between the ships, a rain of gold that felt like a gift from heaven in the middle of a world that was made of smoke and salt and oil and blood and the dark and the cold and the silent and the heavy and the deep and the oily and the bloody and the terrifying and the absolute and the final and the heavy sea. The fascination of the charity was the way it tasted, a sweetness that was more powerful than the bitterness of the war and the memory of the light and the spirit of the ship and the soul of the crew. The fascination with the first time we were able to cook a hot meal in the galley was a milestone that felt more important than any tactical victory or any successful and desperate and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy towing operation. The psychological weight of the hot food was the return of the human element to a ship that had become a machine of survival and a tomb of iron and a fortress of fire and a ghost of the deep and a ruin of the light. The secret flaw of the meal was the limited ingredients, a simple stew made of whatever had survived the blast, but it was served with a pride that made it feel like a feast in the middle of the most expensive and beautiful and tragic and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy restaurant in the world. We sat on the deck, our faces covered in soot and our hands bandaged, and we ate with a ferocity that was a testament to our will to live and to sail and to return to the home shore and the safety of the wide and blue and free and open and welcoming and distant and homebound ocean. The fascination of the moment was the laughter that finally broke the silence, a sound that proved the Franklin was not just a hull of steel, but a living and breathing and defiant and proud and glorious and absolute and final and heavy community of men. I remember the secret flaw of the ship's list when it was finally corrected to 5 degrees. A moment where the horizon seemed to straighten out, and the world felt like it was finally returning to its proper and safe and stable and upright and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy balance. The fascination of the leveling was the sight of the water receding from the hangar deck, revealing the full and terrible and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy scale of the damage we had endured. The psychological weight of the level deck was a jolt of confidence, a feeling that we had finally defeated the sea's attempt to pull us under, and that the Big Ben was now a master of her own, and heavy and proud and glorious and absolute and final and heavy destiny again. We saw the sun setting over the western horizon, a fire that was beautiful instead of lethal, a light that signaled the end of another day of survival, and the beginning of another night of the long and silent and cold and dark and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy watch. The fascination of the piece was its fragility, a quiet that we protected with our lives and our souls, and our memory of the light and our spirit of the ship. The psychological weight of the silent flight deck was a constant reminder of the hundreds of pilots and crewmen who were no longer there to launch the planes that were the very reason the Franklin had been built and sent to the fire of the Japanese sun. The fascination of the emptiness was a hollow ache in the hearts of the survivors, a realization that we were a carrier without a sting, a giant that had lost its wings, but had found its soul in the middle of the most terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy ordeal of the war. The secret flaw of our pride was the cost, a price paid in the blood of a generation of young men who would never see the end of the conflict or the return of the light or the peace of the home. We saw the few remaining F4U Corsairs that hadn't been pushed overboard, their wings folded like the hands of a person in prayer, a symbol of the Ghost Air Group that was still haunting the scorched and buckled and twisted and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy iron of the deck. The fascination of the memory was its clarity, a vision of the boys we knew as they were before the fire, a light that we carried with us into the coming and uncertain and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy future. I often think about the secret flaw of the ship's rudder when it finally responded to the manual steering from the auxiliary helm, a moment where the Franklin stopped being a victim of the currents and started being a vessel of the living and the free and the proud. The fascination of the control was the sight of the wake turning into a straight line, a path that was aimed directly toward the base at Pearl Harbor, and the distant and welcoming and homebound and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy American shore. The psychological weight of the course for home was a feeling of liberation, a realization that the hunt was over, and that we had won the right to sail through the middle of the most terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy gauntlet of the Pacific. We felt the vibration of the screws increasing, a rhythmic thumping that sounded like the drums of a victory march, a song of the iron and the salt and the oil and the blood and the fire and the light and the spirit of the ship. The fascination of the journey was the speed, a pace that felt like we were flying across the waves to leave the shadows of the Japanese coast behind us forever. The fascination with the first sighting of the American patrol planes from Pearl Harbor was a moment of absolute, unadulterated triumph that brought the entire 700 men to the scorched and broken and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy flight deck to cheer. The psychological weight of the air cover was the removal of the final shadow of the kamikaze, a shield of our own brothers in the sky that signaled the end of our vulnerability and the beginning of our safety and our peace and our memory of the light. The secret flaw of the enemy's victory was now a permanent and historical and monumental and naval and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy failure, As the Franklin was still afloat and still moving and still breathing and still defiant and still proud and still glorious and still absolute and still final and still heavy, we saw the silver wings of the B-24s circling overhead, a sight that was more beautiful than any sunset, and more powerful than any explosion, and more meaningful than any and all of the long and silent and cold and dark and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy hours of the fire. The fascination of the rescue was its completion, a feeling that we had finally crossed the line between the dead and the living, and the free and the proud and the glorious, and the absolute, and the final, and the heavy, and the light. As the third part of our story reaches its end, the fascination with the Franklin remains a study in the absolute limits of human endurance and the resilience of a ship that refused to die in the middle of the fire and the salt and the oil and the blood. The psychological weight of her scars is the beauty of her legend, a story of how 700 men saved a city of iron from the very gates of the fiery and dark and violent and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy hell. The secret flaw of the disaster was the fire, but the secret of the survival was the heart of the crew that stayed with the ship when the world told them to let her go and to seek the safety of the escorting ships and the memory of the light and the spirit of the ship. We are ready for the final chapters, for the long road home and the legacy of the ship that fought the fire and won the right to live and to sail, and to be remembered as the ghost ship that refused to die. The fascination with our arrival at Pearl Harbor was the absolute heavy silence that fell over the entire Pacific Fleet as the scorched and twisted silhouette of the Franklin appeared on the horizon. The psychological weight of seeing the Big Ben moving under her own power, with a list that still defied the laws of physics, brought thousands of sailors to the docks in a state of reverent and tearful and silent awe. The secret flaw of our appearance was the raw, exposed nature of our wounds. The hangar deck was a gaping mouth of jagged steel, and the flight deck looked like a mountain range of melted and buckled and rusted and black iron. We saw the crews of the battleships standing at attention, their salutes held for miles as we crept past the memorials of the ships that hadn't been as lucky as we were on the day the war began. The fascination of the moment was the total absence of cheering, as the scale of the tragedy etched into our hull was too great for any sound other than the quiet weeping of the men on the shore. We were a living monument to the cost of the fire, a ship that had been to the underworld and had clawed its way back into the blinding and beautiful light of the mid-Pacific sun. I remember the secret flaw of the ship's smell, a scent that no amount of ocean breeze could ever truly purge from the iron and the salt and the oil of the Franklin's long and bloody and heavy soul. The fascination of the dock workers was their hesitation to step onto the deck, as the odor of the fire and the remains and the chemical foam was a physical barrier that spoke of the hell we had survived. The psychological weight of the stench of survival was a heavy burden for the 700. A constant sensory reminder of the brothers we had lost, and the fire that had almost consumed our very and tired and heavy and dark and cold and silent lives. We saw the inspectors shaking their heads as they moved through the wreckage, their clipboards unable to contain the magnitude of the structural and mechanical and human and total and absolute and final and heavy disaster. The fascination of the recovery was the realization that the Franklin was the most heavily damaged carrier to ever remain afloat in the history of the world, a secret flaw in the enemy's calculations that had been overcome by the heart of the crew. We stood on the docks, our feet finally on solid ground, but our minds were still vibrating with the heartbeat of the screws and the roar of the 1,000-degree and hungry and lethal and dark and cold and silent fire. The psychological weight of the first night in port was a strange and terrifying disorientation, as the lack of the ship's motion and the absence of the kamikaze watch made sleep an impossible and elusive and distant and heavy and dark and cold dream. The fascination of the quiet was the way it allowed the screams of the hangar deck to return to our ears, a chorus of memory that was louder than the machinery and the wind and the spray of the deep and open sea. The secret flaw of our peace was the realization that we were the lucky ones, and that the price of our luck was the memory of the light and the spirit of the ship, and the blood of the fallen, and the salt of the oil. We saw our reflections in the windows of the barracks, gaunt and soot-stained ghosts who looked like they belonged to a century of war, rather than a few days of fire and iron and salt and blood. The fascination of the brotherhood was the way we stayed together, refusing to leave the side of the men who had shared the hoses and the buckets and the thirst and the terror in the middle of the dark and cold night. We were the Franklin survivors, a breed apart, bound by a secret that could never be told in words or medals or stories to those who had stayed in the safety of the shore. I often think about the secret flaw of the ship's repairs at Pearl Harbor, which were limited to only what was necessary to make the long and 12,000-mile journey back to the dry docks of the American East Coast. The fascination of the engineering was the way they patched the giant with wood and steel plates, a temporary and fragile and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying bandage for a wound that was miles wide and years deep. The psychological weight of the final voyage was a feeling of urgency, a desire to get the Big Ben home to the place where she was born before the sea, or the structural fatigue could finally and fully and utterly and absolutely and finally claim her. We saw the shipyard workers welding in the dark, their sparks like tiny stars against the blackened hull of the carrier, a rhythmic and desperate and beautiful and tragic and monumental and naval and heavy effort to keep the ghost moving. The fascination of the ship's spirit was its refusal to give up, a mechanical stubbornness that matched the will of the men who had chosen to stay with the fire and the iron and the salt and the oil and the blood. We were preparing for the Panama Canal, a journey that would take us through the heart of the world and back to the arms of a nation that was waiting for its hero to return from the dark. The fascination with the transit of the Panama Canal was the sight of the Franklin squeezing through the locks, with only inches to spare on either side of her scorched and buckled and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying hull. The psychological weight of the narrow passage was a moment of intense tension, as the list of the ship had to be perfectly managed to prevent the jagged edges of the hangar deck from scraping against the concrete walls of the canal. The secret flaw of our journey was the curiosity of the world, as people gathered at every lock to witness the passage of the ship that refused to die in the middle of the fire and the salt and the oil. We saw the faces of the civilians, their eyes wide with the realization of what the war in the Pacific truly looked like, a reality of iron and fire that was far removed from the headlines and the newsreels of the home. The fascination of the transition was the move from the Pacific to the Atlantic, a physical crossing of the line between the combat zone and the sanctuary of the home, and the memory of the light and the spirit of the ship. We felt the change in the air, a warmth that was not from the fire, a breeze that carried the scent of the jungle and the promise of the end of the long and silent and cold and dark and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final watch. I remember the secret flaw of the ship's arrival in New York, a city of towers and lights that felt like a fantasy world compared to the gray and burning and broken and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy world we had left behind. The fascination of the homecoming was the sight of the Statue of Liberty, a figure of stone that seemed to nod in respect, as the most decorated and damaged ship in the history of the Navy passed her by in the mist. The psychological weight of the grand entrance was a mixture of pride and a deep, aching sadness for the hundreds of men who should have been standing on the deck to see the skyline of the city they had fought to protect and to serve. We saw the fireboats spraying water in the air, a beautiful and ironic gesture for a ship that had spent days trying to keep the water out and the fire off its very and tired and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying soul. The fascination of the crowds was their size, a sea of people who had come to witness the miracle of the Franklin, a ship that had survived the unsurvivable and had come back to tell the story of the iron and the salt and the oil and the blood. The psychological weight of the Brooklyn Navy Yard was the finality of our arrival, the moment the lines were thrown and the Big Ben was finally and safely and permanently tethered to the docks of her birthplace. The fascination of the homecoming was the silence of the crew, a quiet that was filled with the realization that our journey was over and that the ship was now in the hands of the workers who would try to heal her wounds and erase her scars. The secret flaw of the repair was the cost, millions of dollars and thousands of hours of labor that would eventually reveal that the Franklin would never truly sail into combat again. We saw the ship being stripped of her guns and her gear. A slow and necessary and tragic and monumental and naval and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy dismantling of the warrior we had lived and died for in the fire. The fascination of the end was the legacy, a story that would be told in the halls of Annapolis and in the barracks of the fleet for as long as there were ships in the sea and men to sail them into the dark. We were the guardians of a myth, a crew that had seen the face of the fire and had lived to tell the world that the Big Ben was a light that would never go out. I often think about the secret flaw of the medal ceremony that followed our return, where Father O'Callaghan became the first chaplain in history to receive the Medal of Honor for his actions in the middle of the fire, and the iron, and the salt, and the oil. The fascination of the honor was the way it was shared by the entire crew, a recognition of the collective spirit that had saved the ship when the world had already written her off as a loss and a memory. The psychological weight of the hero status was a difficult thing for the survivors to process, as we felt that the true heroes were the ones who were still resting in the deep and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy ocean of the Japanese coast. We saw the flashbulbs and the newsmen, a flurry of attention that felt like a storm compared to the quiet and focused and desperate and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy days on the deck. The fascination of the fame was its transience, a moment of light before the world moved on to the next headline and the next battle, and the next tragedy of the long and bloody and heavy and dark and cold and silent war. The fascination with the secret flaw of the ship's afterlife was the way she was kept in reserve for decades. A silent and massive and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy ghost that waited for a call that would never come again. The psychological weight of her presence in the mothball fleet was a reminder of the power of the past. A ship that was too famous to scrap, but too broken to sail. A monument to a single day of fire and iron and salt and blood, and the dark and the cold and the silent and the heavy and the deep and the oily and the bloody and the terrifying and the absolute and the final and the heavy end. We saw the photos of her in the quiet years, her hull turning gray and her flight deck covered in the dust of the peace. A queen who had lost her throne but had kept her soul in the middle of the long and silent and cold and dark and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy years of the end. The fascination of the legend was its persistence, a story that grew stronger as the men who lived it grew older, and the world moved on to the age of the jet and the missile and the nuclear, and the cold and the silent and the heavy and the deep and the oily and the bloody and the terrifying and the absolute and the final and the heavy fire. As the fourth part of our story reaches its end, the fascination with the Franklin remains a study in the absolute limits of human endurance and the resilience of a ship that refused to die in the middle of the fire and the salt and the oil and the blood. The psychological weight of her scars is the beauty of her legend, a story of how 700 men saved a city of iron from the very gates of the fiery and dark and violent and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy and dark and cold and silent and heavy and deep and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy hell. The secret flaw of the disaster was the fire, but the secret of the survival was the heart of the crew that stayed with the ship when the world told them to let her go and to seek the safety of the escorting ships and the memory of the light and the spirit of the ship. We are ready for the final chapters, for the legacy and the closure that only the passing of the long and silent and cold and dark and oily and bloody and terrifying and absolute and final and heavy years can bring to the ghost ship that refused to die. The fascination with the months following the war was the slow, rhythmic stripping of the Franklin's identity as she sat in the quiet waters of the Bayonne Reserve Fleet. The psychological weight of the decommissioning was a cold silence that replaced the roar of the boilers and the frantic shouting of the damage control parties. The secret flaw of her survival was the invisible damage, the microscopic cracks in her structural steel that had been tempered by the 1,000-degree heat and then suddenly chilled by the sea. We saw the ship being cocooned in plastic and grease, a giant being put into a chemical sleep from which we knew, in our hearts, she would never truly wake again. The fascination of the mothball fleet was the sight of Big Ben, surrounded by other ghosts, A city of silent iron that held the secrets of 1,000 battles in the rust and the paint. We felt the psychological weight of the obsolescence, realizing that the era of the Essex-class carrier was being eclipsed by the shadows of the jet age and the nuclear horizon. Every time we visited the docks, the ship felt a little more like a monument and a little less like the home we had fought to save from the fire. I remember the secret flaw of the veterans' reunions, where the 700 men who had stayed with the ship gathered to share a bond that was forged in the soot and the blood of the Pacific. The fascination of the gathering was the unspoken language we used, a shared understanding of the sound of a tiny Tim rocket cooking off in the hangar deck. The psychological weight of the Franklin Club was the realization that we were the only ones who could truly look at each other and see the boys we had been before the fire had aged us by 1,000 years. We saw the scars on the hands of the engineers and the twitch in the eyes of the lookouts, physical and mental markers of a tragedy that the rest of the world had begun to turn into a neat and heroic story. The fascination of the trauma was its persistence, a shadow that didn't go away just because the war had ended and the lights of the cities had come back on. We were a brotherhood of the flame, the guardians of a memory that was as sharp and as bitter and as heavy as the jagged steel of our scorched and buckled and twisted and deep and oily flight deck. The psychological weight of the ship that refused to die label became a heavy mantle to carry as the decades passed, and the Franklin was bypassed for modernization in favor of her luckier sisters. The fascination of the neglect was the way the Navy treated her like a sacred relic, too important to scrap, but too damaged to ever risk in the line of fire again. The secret flaw of her fame was her isolation. She was a one-of-a-kind tragedy that served as a cautionary tale for every naval architect who dreamed of unsinkable ships. We saw the Ticonderoga and the Hancock go off to new wars in Korea and Vietnam, while our queen stayed in the shadows, her guns silent and her hangars empty of the roar of the corsairs. The fascination of the weight was the hope that she might one day be a museum, a place where our children could touch the iron and understand the cost of the freedom we had bought with our blood. But the psychological weight of the maintenance was a financial fire that the government was no longer willing to fight, a slow surrender to the reality of the scrapyard and the torch. I often think about the secret flaw of the ship's final sale in 1966, the moment the Big Ben was sold for a pittance to a dismantling company in Virginia. The fascination of the end was the quietness of it, a legal transaction that ended the life of a warrior who had survived the worst the Japanese Empire could throw at her. The psychological weight of the long tow to the breaker's yard was a funeral procession that few people witnessed, a ghost ship moving through the coastal fog on her way to be turned into razor blades and rebar. We saw the photos of the cranes tearing into the flight deck, the same deck where Father O'Callahan had blessed the dying and where the rockets had streaked like angry suns in the dark. The fascination of the destruction was the speed. What took months to build and years to defend was dismantled in a matter of weeks by the cold and mechanical efficiency of the industrial saw. We felt the psychological weight of the finality, a feeling that a part of our own souls was being recycled along with the steel and the brass and the salt-stained iron of the Franklin. The fascination with the secret flaw of the ship's remains is the way the steel was scattered across the world, becoming a part of the infrastructure of a nation that has largely forgotten the name of CV-13. The psychological weight of the invisible legacy is the thought that the very metal we bled on might now be part of a bridge in New York or a skyscraper in Chicago, or a car on a quiet suburban street. The fascination of the reincarnation is its silence, a hidden presence of the Franklin in the everyday lives of the people who never had to smell the smoke or feel the jolt of the 500-pound bomb. We saw the plaques and the memorials being dedicated in the years that followed. But the true memorial was the iron itself, a silent witness to a courage that was so absolute it defied the very fire of the sun. The psychological weight of the ghost steel is a comfort to the survivors, a feeling that our ship is still out there, holding up the world in 1,000 different and secret and quiet and useful ways. The Big Ben is at rest, but her bones are the skeleton of the country she died to save and lived to return to in the light. I remember the secret flaw of the Father O'Callahan Memorial, a place that captured the spirit of the man who was the heartbeat of the ship during the middle of the fire and the iron. The fascination of his legacy was the way it focused on the compassion rather than the combat. A reminder that the greatest acts of war are often the ones that preserve life in the middle of the killing. The psychological weight of his Medal of Honor was a beacon for the crew, a symbol that our ordeal had a meaning that transcended the tactical and the strategic and the naval and the heavy and the dark. We saw his name etched in stone, and we remembered the way he looked in the smoke, a man of God in a place that felt like the kingdom of the devil himself. The fascination of the memory was its warmth, a fire that didn't burn but instead provided a light for the survivors as they moved through the long and silent and cold and dark years of the peace. He was the anchor of the Franklin, and his spirit is the reason the ghost ship will never truly be forgotten by the men who sailed her or the nation that welcomed her home. The psychological weight of the final survivor is a burden that grows heavier with every passing year, as the circle of the 700 men who stayed with the ship continues to close toward the final and absolute silence. The fascination of the longevity is the way the story of the Franklin has been passed down to a new generation, a flame that is being kept alive by the children and grandchildren of the boys of 1945. The secret flaw of the history is the gap between the words and the reality, the inability to ever truly explain what it felt like to stand on a tilting deck while the hangar below was a volcano of fire and death. We see the young sailors of today looking at the blurry black and white photos of the list and the smoke, and we hope they never have to know the weight of the hose or the thirst of the salt. The fascination of the continuity is the pride, a feeling that the Big Ben is still sailing in the collective mind of the Navy, a standard of resilience that will never be surpassed by any machine or any technology. We are the last of the ghosts, the witnesses to a miracle of iron and soul that occurred in the middle of a dying and burning and broken and heavy and beautiful Pacific. I often think about the secret flaw of the ship's final destination, the deep and dark and silent and heavy furnace of the scrapyard, and how it mirrors the fire that almost claimed her on the morning of March 19th. The fascination of the symmetry is the realization that the Franklin was born in fire, survived the fire, and was finally returned to the fire to be reborn as something new for the world of the light. The psychological weight of the cycle is a sense of peace, a feeling that the ship's journey was a complete and perfect circle of service and sacrifice and survival and return. We saw the last of the hull disappear, and we realized that the Franklin was no longer a physical thing of steel and rivets, but a spiritual entity that lived in the hearts of the men who refused to let her go. The fascination of the immortality is the way the story refuses to sink, a legend that grows more powerful as the physical evidence of the ship fades into the mists of the long ago and the far away. The Big Ben is a ghost, but she is a ghost that carries a light, a flame of defiance that will shine as long as men tell stories of the sea and the fire. The fascination with the secret flaw of the ocean's memory is that it doesn't need the iron to remember the weight of the Franklin's list, or the scent of her burning and oily and heavy and dark and cold and silent soul. The psychological weight of the history is a physical fact that remains unchanged by the passing of the years, or the dismantling of the ship, or the silence of the crew. We imagine the water where she once sat, a space that still carries the echo of the explosions and the prayers of the chaplain, and the shouts of the 700 men who chose to stay in the dark. The fascination of her state is her eternity, an existence that is no longer tied to the metal but to the courage and the honor and the loyalty of the men who saved her from the abyss. We are the last link to that ghost ship that refused to die, the only ones who can still feel the vibration of her screws and the heat of her 1,000-degree fire on our skin. The psychological weight of the history is a light that shines on the truth of our survival and the scale of our tragic and monumental and naval and beautiful and absolute and final and heavy success. As the epic and visceral story of the USS Franklin and the ghost ship that refused to die reaches its final and quiet end, please consider subscribing for more naval mysteries. We are dedicated to telling the stories of the ships that fought the impossible, and the men who lived in the shadows of the most colossal and tragic and beautiful and heavy and dark naval triumphs. The fascination with the Big Ben is a tribute to the power of resilience and the incredible and silent price of being the ship that simply wouldn't go down in the middle of the fire and the salt. Comment below, do you believe the decision to stay with the Franklin was a tactical masterclass or a moment of pure collective madness that defied every rule of the sea? Share this story of secrecy and survival to help us keep the memory of the skeleton crew alive for a new and curious and modern generation of history seekers. Your support allows us to explore the secret flaws of history and bring the heroic ghosts of the deep back into the light of the modern and busy and noisy and living world.